Hello there, welcome to another CleaveTech tech tip. So this week's topic comes from a number of conversations I've had with people about the size of things. More specifically, axles. But it's more than just axles, it's about the size of things in general and whether you can trust your equipment. So let's get on and use some of this equipment in front of me and see if size does really matter. So in front of me here, I've got a number of different pieces of equipment here. I've got 4 different calipers here. They're digital calipers. They're not vernier calipers. They don't use a vernier scale. They use a digital readout. So they're not vernier calipers, they're digital calipers. So I've got 4 different versions of those. I have a normal sort of micrometer here in a little vise there and a little stand. And I've got a couple of axles. And we're going to measure them, see what difference we get on these axles with these different pieces of equipment, and then you can see whether you can trust your equipment or not. So we'll start with this piece of equipment to start with. It's a 100mm digital caliper with a little plastic casing. Don't know exactly what make it is, but I'm going to open it up, make sure it's zeroed. There we go. It's always worth making sure the jaws are clean before you measure anything as well. So make sure there's no dirt or dust in between the jaws. Just check there, zero it again. Open it up. Close it down. There we are. So we're getting a consistent zero reading now. So I had to zero it a couple of times to get that. And we'll take this axle and then we'll measure the diameter of this axle. Now I'm not going to measure it right at the very end here of the jaws, because if I measure it right at the very end of the jaws, I'm actually getting some flex perhaps in the jaws and some flex in the digital unit itself here, if it's not quite set up right. It's best to measure as close to the top of the jaws as you can, but obviously not in this little gap here. So these bits that are ground away here really are only for getting into little tiny areas if you have to, with the tips of the jaws. You want to try and measure as close as you can to the inside of the jaws if possible, where you can. So I'm going to measure that, bring it open, bring it in 2.41, 2.40, depending again on how tightly I push with my thumb against the axle. So it's probably somewhere in between. So these calipers here give me 2.41 millimeters. Next up, again another set of digital calipers, 100mm digital calipers. These have a metal body on them rather than the plastic body. So again, I'll check that these zero, open, close, zero them. Yep, so I'm getting consistent zero now with these. So let's open this up. Let's measure again. 2.38. Quite a bit different from the last one that I got with these calipers here. 2.38 for this axle. Now the third set of calipers, these are 150mm digital calipers, slightly different to the other one, similar sort of design but slightly different button placement. So let's turn them on, make sure the jaws are clear. Make sure I'm getting consistent zeros. Yes. So let's have a measure. Oh look, 2.39. Doesn't matter how hard I push, 2.39 for these, somewhere in between. And my last set of digital calipers, these are 200mm ones. So turn them on, open them up. Seem to be getting consistent zero. So what do I get with exactly the same axle again? Interesting, 2.36 this time for this axle. Same axle as before, different calipers, 2.36. Quite a bit of difference. So I've put the results on the screen now of all 4 calipers. You can see I get quite a bit of difference, measuring from 2.41 to 2.36 for the same axle. Now I'm pretty sure that all these calipers claimed a resolution of 0.01 millimeters. Now that means that the display on them can go up in 0.01 millimeter steps, and that pretty much does. Let's have a look at this one, for example. Let's have a look. So we bring it up
7982687 9 3 4
6. So you can get it to go up in 0.01 millimeter steps, but it is quite hard, but it will do it. So the resolution is 0.01, and that's what they claim. But that doesn't mean that it measures accurately to 0.01 millimeters. When you look at the spec sheet for these calipers, and I'll put one on the screen now, they often tell you resolution and accuracy. So I've just mentioned resolution to you. So resolution is the size of the steps on the reading here, on the readout, and accuracy is how close the reading on the readout is to the real true size of the object. So looking at the example on the screen, you can see that although some devices have quite a small resolution, so tiny steps, their accuracy might not be so great. Now, do these devices fit in with that accuracy? Well, let's try another device, see what we get, and then we can maybe see if we can find out which ones are better than others. So the next tool I'm going to use is this micrometer. It wasn't a massively expensive one, but the manufacturer claims it obviously has a resolution of 0.01 millimeters, but its accuracy is 0.004 millimeters. So it actually has a greater accuracy than the resolution on here, which means that whatever it reads on here should be pretty close to the real size. So let's have a measurement of the same axle again, and let's see what we get. So we'll better just check the zero. Always worth checking the zero. So there we go. We can see a little clutch on the end slips. You can hear it clicking. And we can see that the two zero lines line up. So the zero lines up with a line in the middle. So let's back it off. So you can also see, if I start there and I come round the barrel here and I get back to the zero, that's 0.5 millimeter. So one turn is 0.5 millimeter. 2 whole turns bring me to a whole millimeter. And you can see I've got 0.5 millimeter marks on the bottom and whole millimeter marks on the top of this central line that's running through here. So coming out here until the axle sits in, and then I wind it in on the axle, holding the axle very, very loosely, because I don't want to hold the axle at an angle and make the clutch slip before it's reached the right size. So hold the axle nice and loosely in between the jaws, and then just check it a couple of times. There we go, and that's where the clutch starts slipping. So the reading I'm getting is 2 whole millimeters. Haven't reached the extra 0.5 millimeter yet, so I'm actually reaching 2.36 millimeters. That's what I'm getting with the end of this axle. And you can see I've gone past the 3.5, and it's the next mark that's lined up with that central line. So 2.36 millimeters measuring with this micrometer. Now, going by the accuracy of this device, or the claimed accuracy by the manufacturer, that could mean that it's 2.364 millimeters, or it could be 2.356 millimeters. So this micrometer here is obviously designed for measuring smaller items more accurately than something like the digital calipers here that we were using before. So I would trust the measurement on this micrometer of this axle much more than I would the measurement on the digital caliper. So which digital calipers were closer? So does it actually matter which digital caliper was closer or which one's more accurate? Well, in some respects, yes, it does. In some respects, it doesn't. And I'll explain now. Well, if you were measuring something, I mean, I've taken this axle as an example, but if you're measuring something and you wanted to share the measurement with somebody else and tell somebody else like what size of something you were using, then probably the accuracy of your caliper or your measuring device does matter. But if you were just measuring for your own benefit to compare it against something else, then it doesn't really matter. If you're using the same tool to measure everything that you do, you're just comparing the size between them. So therefore, it doesn't matter so much how accurate it is, as long as it is consistent. So why is all this important? Why am I going into all this depth about measuring something when I've not really mentioned slot cars very much at all in my tech tip? And why is this a tech tip? Well, one of the most common sizes of axle for a slot car is a 332 axle, or 3/32 of an inch is the nominal size given for an axle. Now, that works out at just over 2.38 millimeters. 2.3813 to be a little bit more precise in terms of millimeters. All manufacturers of axles and slot cars, they all use slightly different sizes. They're not all 332. And even when you buy a 332 axle, it's not always the same 332 axle as you got last time, even from the same manufacturer. Everybody has a tolerance. Now, I know a lot of people use drill blanks for axles. And a common size of a drill blank is a number 42 drill blank in America. Now that comes out at 2.3749 millimeters to be accurate. But again, that has a tolerance on it. So it could be a bit smaller than that. It could be a bit bigger than that. Now on drill blanks, the tolerance tends to be quite large compared to slot car manufacturer tolerances. Now if you bought a 332 axle, true 332 axle, then obviously that's 2.381 millimeters. So that's a little bit bigger than a number 42 drill. You can also look at slot car manufacturers such as NSR and slot.it. Now NSR claim their axles are 2.37 millimeters and slot.it claim theirs are 2.38. So that means that the slot.it cars will probably have a slightly larger hole in their gears and their hubs than the NSRs. So if you ran perhaps a normal slot car axle, which tends to be more on the side of 2.36, 2.37 millimeters, then you would find it would wobble around in your slot.it gears and your slot.it hubs, and they wouldn't run very true on the axle. So let's just look at this hub and this axle on my balancer. Let's spin it. Now, if you look very closely, you can see it's running pretty true. The wheel's not, or the hub's not wobbling around very much here. So you can see it stays pretty true. But if that was running on an axle that wasn't the right size, and I'll show you this as an extreme example, you can see this axle here is far too small for the bore in the hub. So if I were to tighten that up onto this axle here, like so, and then I'll put it in my balancer and spin it, let's see what happens. So there we go. We can see that it's not running very true at all because this hub is not sitting nice and central or concentric with the axle, because the axle is a slightly different size than the bore of the hub. Now that's a very extreme case, but you can see that if you balance your wheels or your hubs or your gears on a different size axle to the axles you use in your car, then you're not going to get very accurate balancing. Or it's going to be perhaps a bit better than it was before, but it's not as accurate as you could possibly get if you try and match the size of your axle with the size of the axle on your balancer with the size of the axles you run in your car. You've also got to consider that if you buy axles from different manufacturers, now these are axles that I bought from two different manufacturers. I don't know exactly which ones they are. They're not marked on them, but let's measure them and see what happens. So this one here measures at 2.37, so 2.3567, in fact just a fraction over 2.37. This one measures at somewhere in between 2.35 and 2.36. So again, a little bit of difference here. Now let's compare those to the hub that I just had here. So fitting the hub onto here, it goes on nicely. It passes over the axle okay. It does go all the way through the axle. Well, the axle goes all the way through the hub on that one. So, and then this other axle here, there's no way that axle is going to fit into that hub. And that was probably only 0.01 of a millimeter difference in the size of the axle. Yet one fits, one doesn't. So getting your nice right size axles makes your wheels run much truer, helps keep your wheels and tyres in balance, and will give you a much smoother, faster car. So what have we learned from this tech tip? Well, we've learned perhaps don't trust your digital caliper to be entirely accurate. They're not that great. They're okay, but they're not that accurate for measuring things. We've learned perhaps that a micrometer is going to be a more accurate tool for measuring things. You can get external ones like this. You can also get internal micrometers and depth micrometers, but obviously you need 3 tools to do the job of 1 tool that you would get on your digital caliper, but it would be more accurate. We've also learned that actually the digital caliper can be used to compare items. So for example, that axle there says 2.39 and this axle here says 2.38. So it's giving me a relative reading between the two that's about right. But obviously we know it's not exactly 2.38 and 2.39. In fact, we know it's not exactly 2.38 and 39, but the micrometer gives us a more accurate reading than our digital caliper would. We've also learned that you could actually just take a hub that you've got and compare your axle sizes to the hub, and then in effect you're using a gauge because the hub is becoming a gauge to gauge your axle sizes, and then you could find ones that are more consistent and make sure that you use those in your racing. I can also point out that don't rely on your digital caliper turning up at scrutineering saying, oh yeah, I can measure it on my caliper and it says it's this, because you know your digital caliper isn't that accurate. It's not going to be the same size as a gauge, or it's not going to read the same size as the gauge. In fact, different gauges can read different sizes, and we all know that from passing technical inspection on some places and not on others. And you say, well, I haven't changed the car at all, it passed last time, Gov, honest. Well, there's plenty of excuses. So the only thing you can really do is to test your car on the gauge that's going to be used in technical inspection. And often at large meetings, they have those gauges available for people to check their cars in advance to make sure they don't fail. So if you do have some axles that are slightly too large, then stick them in your rotary tool. This Proxon is an excellent tool, and I've mentioned it in my other videos. So I'm going to put a link in the video description of where you can get these from. But you can put it into your Proxon, take a little bit of wet and dry paper, you can spin it round, and you can just polish it down with your wet and dry paper. And you can polish the axle, and you'll be surprised at how much of the diameter you can change just by polishing it with a little bit of wet and dry. You can start to take off 0.01 of a millimeter just like that quite quickly, and you can bring your axle down to the ideal size. So if you've got axles that aren't very consistent, then you could spend some time getting your axles to be the right size with a little bit of wet and dry paper and get them all to match. Now, I started this video by explaining that this whole topic had come out of a conversation I had with somebody about axle sizes, and it was to do with the purchase of their balancer and what axle sizes they wanted for their wheels and hubs and gears that they were using in their racing. Now, I supply 2 common sizes of axle for my balancer. This one here measures at 2.37, just over 2.37, so somewhere between 2.37 and 2.38. This one here measures out at between 2.36 and 2.37. So this is my 2.37 for NSR cars. This is my 2.38 for slot.it cars. You'll find if you ran a true 2.38 millimeter axle in a slot.it car, it would be too tight in the hubs. And likewise in the NSR, if you ran a true 2.37 millimeter axle, it would be too tight in your hubs. So I find this 2.365 or thereabouts axle is the best fit for most common slot car hubs. It can sometimes be a little tight in things like Cahosa and S&K hubs, but as I say, you can always just polish down the outside slightly. Be wary you don't polish off the points or mark the points, but you can actually polish it down ever so slightly if you need to fit your hubs. But after your hubs have been used a couple of times, you'll find this is a great fit and matches probably most of the axles you've got in your box. Now, if you've managed to stay watching to the end, well done. I'm going to set you some homework. I want you to go away and measure all your axles. If you know what manufacturer they are, that'll be brilliant. So go and measure your axles and put in the comments down below here, somewhere under here, put there all your axle sizes, or the axle sizes that you've measured. Whether you've got a digital caliper, whether you've got a set of micrometers, maybe put that in the comments as well, whether you've measured them with one or the other device. It'll be great to see all the comments appearing below and seeing what size axles you've actually measured. Maybe check the axles you've got in different cars. Measure those. Are they all the same? Do you get consistent readings from one to the other? Let me know. Stick it in the comments. Once again, thank you very much for watching this video, especially if you stayed all the way to the end. Hit the big C that's coming up here. Subscribe if you haven't done so already. Watch some of my other videos, and I'll be back again next week with another tech tip. See you then.